Lingchi,
Oh, yeah.
death by 1,000 cuts.
Gruesome stuff.
We're going deep on this one today. I've got tons of sources.
Oh, yeah. Piles of them.
All about this infamous execution method.
A really dark chapter in history.
Yeah, definitely dark.
But, looking back at stuff like this,
Yeah,
it can teach us a lot about ourselves.
I think that's true.
Our capacity for cruelty, but also for,
Yeah,
change,
right?
Change, yeah.
So let's start with, the real basic stuff.
Sure.
What was Lingchi?
Okay.
What made it so unbelievably horrifying?
Lingchi, it was a form of both torture and execution, and it was used primarily in China.
Okay.
During the Qing dynasty.
I got it.
And, the name itself, Death by 1,000 Cuts.
Right.
It really gets at the brutality of it.
Yeah, it's right there in the name.
It involved meticulously.
Whoa, meticulously.
Yeah, they took their time.
Wow.
They would slice away portions of flesh from a living person. Yeah.
Over an extended period?
This is awful.
It was designed to maximize their suffering.
Yeah.
Before death finally came.
It's unimaginable.
It really is.
So, like we were saying, this wasn't used for just any crime.
Right.
Our sources mention that Lingchi was reserved for,
the worst of the worst.
the most severe offenses.
Exactly.
Okay.
Treason, major rebellion,
Okay.
particularly egregious acts.
So, going against the emperor.
Yeah, defiance against the imperial authority.
Got it.
It wasn't simply about punishing the individual.
Yeah.
It was meant to,
Make a statement.
send a message
Get power.
to everyone.
Yeah.
To demonstrate the absolute power
Of the emperor.
of the emperor. Yeah.
And I guess also,
The consequence.
what happens
Yeah.
when you challenge that power?
Absolutely.
So it's like a tool of terror.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
I mean, imagine
It's chilling to think about.
witnessing this execution.
Yeah.
Hearing the screams.
Of the condemned.
It's just awful.
It was a spectacle.
Yeah. Our sources actually detail
Mhm.
how,
Right.
the execution
They did it out in the open.
public.
Mm.
Purposely, they wanted people to see it.
Oh, yeah. Lots of people.
Okay, so why was that considered so important?
It was all about sending a message.
Okay.
You see this.
Don't even think about it.
This could be you.
Wow.
The brutality of the process
Yeah.
was meant to instill fear
Got it.
in anyone who might even think
Yeah.
about going against the state.
So it's like a gruesome reminder.
Yeah.
Don't step out of line.
Exactly.
I mean, our sources,
Yeah.
they go into detail about how it was actually carried out.
It's tough to read.
And it's honestly hard to stomach.
Yeah.
Can you even walk us through that?
Okay. So
How was Lingchi actually carried out?
the condemned person, stripped and bound,
Okay.
off into a wooden frame.
Like a cross or something.
Or a cross.
Yeah.
Got it. And it wasn't just one executioner.
No.
Multiple executioners would participate,
Wow.
each with their own,
Tools.
yeah, specialized knives
Jeez.
designed for slicing away flesh,
Ugh.
but not causing immediate death.
Oh, my God.
And they'd start with the extremities,
Okay.
fingers, toes, ears,
Oh, God.
and then they'd slowly work their way in.
So that's where the whole 1,000 cuts idea comes in.
Exactly.
It wasn't about
One quick blow.
Mm.
No, it was about making it last
Prolonging the pain.
as long as possible.
It's awful.
Some of the sources
Yeah.
mention instances where the execution could last
For days.
for days.
That's just unbelievable.
It's hard to imagine the psychological impact, the
Yeah.
anticipation, the constant pain, knowing that death is coming,
Yeah.
but so slowly.
Yeah. It's beyond comprehension.
Beyond comprehension. There was this one detail I read in one of the sources,
Mm.
and it just stuck with you.
It just stuck with me.
Okay.
It said that sometimes families of the case condemned,
Yeah.
they could actually
Bribe people.
bribe the executioners
Yeah.
to give their loved one
To end it quickly.
a quicker death,
Yeah.
a more merciful death.
It's a horrifying thought.
It is.
But even in this system,
Yeah.
there was this...
Glimmer
Yeah.
of, I don't know if compassion is the right word,
It's tough to say.
but
yeah.
a recognition
Yeah.
that this was inhumane.
Yeah, like a tiny sliver of humanity
Yeah.
in this whole awful system.
Yeah. I mean, it's a really interesting point.
Right.
Just speaks to how complex
Yeah.
the morality was
They're complicated.
surrounding this.
Yeah.
I mean, on one hand,
The cruelty.
you had the state
The
sanctioned
state is doing this.
cruelty of Lingchi.
Yeah.
And then on the other,
You have individuals.
You have these people
Trying to make it a little less awful.
trying to reduce the suffering.
Yeah. Right.
Within this horrific system.
Within this horrible practice.
I mean, thank goodness.
Yeah.
That Lingchi was
Finally
abolished.
Sure.
So, like, what led to its downfall?
Okay.
Was it just because it was so brutal?
Well, in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, there was a growing movement in China for legal reform.
Got it.
And Lingchi, with its undeniable cruelty, became a focal point for those who wanted
a better system,
a more humane justice system. But it wasn't just internal pressure.
No.
There was also pressure from outside of China.
Oh, interesting.
The international community condemned this practice.
Got it.
And that added weight to the calls.
For abolition.
Yeah, to get rid of it.
So,
finally, in 1905, Lingchi was officially outlawed.
That's amazing.
It really is.
I mean, it just shows that even the most deeply entrenched practices.
Things that seem like they'll never change. They can change. That just takes time.
And effort.
And pressure.
The abolition of Lingchi. It shows a shift.
In values.
In societal values.
Yeah. People started to recognize that human dignity matters.
Everyone deserves.
Everyone deserves.
A basic level of respect.
Absolutely.
And we should reject these extreme forms of punishment.
Yeah. It's a good reminder
that things can change.
Things can change for the better.
Yeah.
We just have to keep pushing.
Yeah, we have to keep pushing.
For a better world.
For a better world.
Where things like Lingchi are just a distant memory.
Just a bad dream. Impalement.
A subject that certainly sends shivers down the spine.
It's one of those topics you don't exactly bring up at the dinner table.
No, not unless you want to clear the room pretty quickly.
So let's just get right into it then, shall we? Impalement. As brutal as it sounds.
Absolutely. It's a grim reminder of, well, what humans are capable of, isn't it?
When we talk about impalement, we're talking about sharp objects.
Stakes, poles, spikes, you name it, driven right through the body.
And this wasn't some, like, isolated practice either. This was widespread.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, geographically and historically, we see impalement all over the place.
We're talking Mesopotamia, Rome, Persia, even parts of Africa.
It's a truly global phenomenon, and that in itself, I think, speaks volumes.
It makes you wonder, why? Why such a horrific method?
Well, it boils down to power, doesn't it? And control.
It's about making a statement.
Exactly, a very, very public and terrifying one.
Imagine for a second, you're in, say, ancient Rome.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
And you see someone impaled on a hilltop.
Visible for miles.
Talk about sending a message.
Chilling. Absolutely chilling. Just the thought of it. It's meant to break you.
The psychological impact alone.
Oh, immense. And that was the point, wasn't it? To instill utter fear, not just in the victim,
but in anyone who might even think of stepping out of line.
Precisely. But impalement itself wasn't, one size fits all. There were variations.
Different methods, different levels of, suffering.
Yes. The type of object used, where it was inserted.
All these factors played a role.
In how long the victim would survive.
Yeah.
And how agonizing that survival would be.
Some methods were designed to crush vital organs.
Leading to a slow, excruciating death.
Others to pierce arteries.
Internal bleeding. Again, a prolonged and horrific end.
It's hard to even fathom the cruelty involved.
But as difficult as it is, we have to try, don't we? To understand it, to learn from it.
Speaking of understanding, the Romans, a civilization known for its laws, its governance.
Right. Advanced in many ways.
But they also embraced impalement.
A bit of a paradox, isn't it?
It seems almost contradictory.
It highlights the complexities of human nature. You see, for the Romans, especially during their conquests,
impalement was a tool.
A tool for control, to maintain order in these newly acquired territories.
And to punish those who dared to resist.
A very public display of Roman might. This is what happens if you defy us.
Now, when we think of the Romans, we often think of crucifixion.
Right. A very specific and brutal form of execution.
And while it's often depicted as nails through the hands and feet,
there were instances where impalement was involved as well.
Victims affixed to a cross, a stake driven through their body.
Another method of slow, agonizing death. Meant to be seen. A warning to all who might question Roman authority.
It's amazing how these practices evolved, adapted by different cultures.
Oh, absolutely. The Romans are one example, but the Ottomans, They took impalement to a whole other level.
And no figure is more infamous in this regard than Vlad the Impaler.
Ah, Vlad, the 15th century ruler of Wallachia. The man who inspired the legend of Dracula.
Now that's where things get interesting. So you're telling me the origin story of Dracula, one of literature's most enduring figures of horror,
is rooted in a very real and very brutal history of impalement.
I'm hooked. Tell me more.
Well, Vlad earned his nickname for a reason. He embraced impalement on a scale that's almost unimaginable.
We're talking tens of thousands.
Tens of thousands, allegedly, met their end on his stakes. His reign was one of terror, cemented his place in history as a symbol of, well, cruelty and barbarity.
It's hard to believe this was real.
But it was. And his story, as gruesome as it is a reminder of the darkness that can reside in the human heart. Vlad the Impaler, a name whispered with both fear and fascination, a figure who continues to captivate even centuries after his death.
Vlad the Impaler. It's incredible how a figure like that, becomes this almost mythical figure, transcends time.
Well, I suppose the imagery is just so potent, so disturbing. It lends itself to those darker narratives. It's no surprise that he, with his penchant for impalement, became such an inspiration for storytellers.
I mean, we're talking about impalement in a historical context. But its legacy, it goes way beyond that. It's in art, literature, movies. We can't seem to escape it, can we?
It's true. Despite its horrific nature, it seems to hold a certain fascination for us. Maybe because it represents that ultimate suffering, that darkness within humanity.
Can you give us some specific examples of how it's been used symbolically?
Sure. In literature, we see impalement often used to create that sense of horror, to emphasize the brutality of a character or event. Think of Bram Stoker's Dracula, for instance.
Right, the vampire impaling his victims. It's a chilling image, and it plays right into those themes of power or dominance.
Exactly. Even in a fictional context, it carries those connotations. Control, subjugation, it's a powerful image, can evoke a whole range of emotions.
What about in art? How has impalement been depicted visually?
Well, it's appeared in various forms, often in religious contexts, or scenes of battle, martyrdom. One famous example is Matthias Grünewald's Eisenheim altarpiece.
I'm familiar with that piece, The Crucifixion of Christ.
While it doesn't explicitly show impalement, it emphasizes Christ's suffering. The nails piercing his hands and feet, evoking that agony.
It's hard not to see the connection there between crucifixion and impalement.
The connection is definitely there. Both forms of capital punishment involving the piercing of the body, a slow, agonizing death.
It's remarkable how these images from centuries ago can still resonate with us today.
They do, and they serve as a reminder, however uncomfortable, of that capacity for cruelty that exists within us. We have to confront that, learn from it.
You've touched on something really important there. The study of impalement, while unsettling, can be valuable.
Absolutely. Historians have delved into this, trying to understand the motivations behind it, the cultural contexts, how it was perceived by those who witnessed it.
So what have we learned from these studies?
Well, we've gained a deeper understanding of how power was exercised in different societies, the role of violence in shaping social hierarchies, and how our attitudes towards punishment, human rights, have evolved. It's given us valuable lessons, albeit disturbing ones, about the human capacity for both cruelty and compassion.
It seems the study of impalement, while definitely not for the faint of heart, can be a tool for growth.
I'd agree with that. It forces us to confront the darker aspects of our history, to examine our own values and beliefs.
Now, moving beyond the historical and symbolic, it's important to acknowledge that impalement, despite its widespread use, did eventually decline. What led to that?
Well, several factors contributed. Evolving social norms, changing views on punishment, a growing emphasis on human rights. The Enlightenment, for example, played a key role. Thinkers like Cesar Beccaria advocated for a more humane approach.
So a shift away from inflicting pain is the primary goal of punishment.
Exactly. The idea that punishment should serve a purpose beyond just retribution, reforming criminals, reintegrating them into society.
Were there any specific events or movements that pushed for the formal abolition of impalement?
The rise of international human rights movements in the 20th century was crucial. Organizations like the United Nations, working to establish standards for the treatment of prisoners, outlawing practices like torture and inhumane executions.
A global recognition that impalement and similar practices were violations of fundamental human rights.
Right. A growing consensus that all human beings, regardless of their crimes, deserve to be treated with a certain level of dignity.
It's encouraging to see how far we've come.
While there's still work to be done, The abolition of these practices represents a real step forward.
A reminder that progress is possible.
It is, and it highlights the importance of continued vigilance, advocacy, to uphold those rights and make sure those horrors aren't resurrected.
Speaking of vigilance, while impalement is a thing of the past as a formal punishment, its legacy does linger. We see it in art, literature, film, still used as this potent symbol.
The imagery is just so powerful. It sticks with us. It's a reminder of the depths of human cruelty, but also perhaps a cautionary tale, urging us to strive for a world where that kind of barbarity is nothing more than a distant memory.
It really is fascinating, isn't it? How something so horrific can be both repulsive and captivating at the same time. It's like we're drawn to it even as we're disgusted by it. Impalement. It just gets under your skin, doesn't it?
I think you've put your finger on something quite profound there. That duality, that push and pull, it speaks to the very nature of, well, of the human experience. We're capable of such incredible acts of cruelty, but also, remarkable compassion. It's a constant struggle, I think, between those two forces.
It's like the potential for both good and evil. It resides within us all. And the choices we make, well, they shape the course of history, don't they?
It's been quite a journey, hasn't it, this deep dive, through a very, very dark chapter of human history. But even within that darkness, we can find those glimmers of hope. The fact that impalement is no longer practiced, the rise of human rights movements, those are testaments to our capacity for progress, our ability to learn from those mistakes of the past and hopefully, strive for something better.
Yeah, it's a reminder that we can't afford to be complacent. The fight for justice, for human dignity, it's ongoing.
Absolutely. We have to remain vigilant, safeguarding those rights, making sure those horrors we talked about, that they truly are relegated to the past. The legacy of impalement, as disturbing as it is, well, it can serve as a powerful reminder of what we're capable of, both the good and the bad.
It's definitely a sobering thought, but I think one worth holding on to. Impalement, a relic of the past. But its tale, it continues to whisper to us, doesn't it? A warning to confront that darkness within ourselves and to keep striving for a world where that kind of brutality is nothing more than, a fading memory, a ghost story we tell ourselves to remind us of what we never want to go back to.
I think that's a good note to end on. A reminder that we have the power to shape the future, to choose compassion over cruelty, to build a world where impalement and all it represents is truly consigned to the history books.
Flaying, the art of skinning alive. Today we're going deep into a rather dark and disturbing subject, flaying.
Flaying, the act of removing a person's skin while they are still alive, it has a long and brutal history.
It's hard to imagine the sheer agony involved. But the sources you've provided indicate that flaying was much more than just physical punishment.
Precisely. The sources suggest it was about asserting dominance and control, reducing a person to their most vulnerable state and stripping away their identity. It was a way to completely dehumanize someone, turning them into a living symbol of powerlessness.
One example that really struck me was the Assyrian practice of flaying their enemies and rebels. The sources detail how they would display the flayed skin on city walls as a warning to others.
That's a chilling example of how flaying was used as a tool of psychological warfare. Imagine living under a regime that employed such brutal tactics. The fear it must have instilled in the population would have been immense.
It's interesting, though, how different cultures employed flaying for completely different reasons. The Aztecs, for example, incorporated flaying into their religious rituals.
That's right. For the Aztecs, flaying was connected to their god of agriculture and renewal, Zipatec. Priests would wear the skins of sacrificial victims during rituals intended to ensure a bountiful harvest.
So the same horrific act takes on completely different meanings depending on the cultural context. It seems flaying served both as a tool of terror and as a sacred ritual, highlighting its complexity.
Exactly. This duality makes flaying a particularly fascinating subject to study. It forces us to confront the darker aspects of human nature and the different ways cultures have sought to justify violence.
So we've touched upon the why, the cultural and symbolic significance of flaying. But what about the how? What did this process actually entail?
According to the sources, it was a meticulously planned and executed process. The victim would be restrained, often tied down, and then the torturer would carefully make small incisions, starting at the face or extremities to maximize the psychological and physical impact.
The sources mention the deliberate pace of the flaying, how they would peel the skin away in strips or sometimes in larger sheets.
That slow, methodical approach was intentional. designed to prolong the agony and break the victim's spirit. It's a truly chilling example of how cruelty can be calculated and deliberate.
The sources also mention the use of salt and other irritants being applied to the exposed nerve endings, further amplifying the pain.
These details underscore the barbarity of the practice and the lengths to which some would go to inflict suffering upon others. It's difficult to comprehend the level of pain and terror these victims must have endured.
One example that I found particularly unsettling was the story recorded by Herodotus about a corrupt Persian judge.
Herodotus describes how this judge was flayed alive and his skin was used to upholster a chair, a chilling reminder to other judges of the consequences of corruption.
That's such a visceral and disturbing image. It highlights how flaying was used not just as a punishment for the individual, but also as a stark warning to others. It was a very public display of power.
It certainly speaks to the psychological impact of flaying, how it was used to instill fear and obedience within a society. The fear of such a gruesome fate would have been a powerful deterrent against disobedience. And the impact of flaying. It extends beyond historical accounts. We can find its traces in art and mythology as well.
Yeah, it's fascinating how this brutal act found its way into storytelling and artistic expression.
One example that comes to mind is the Greek myth of Marsyas, the satyr who challenged the god Apollo to a music contest.
Ah yes, Marsyas, known for his skill with the aloes.
He dared to compete with Apollo, a decision that ultimately sealed his fate. When Marsyas lost the contest, Apollo, enraged by his hubris, flayed him alive.
This myth serves as a cautionary tale about the consequences of pride and challenging the divine order. It also speaks to the power of flaying as a symbol of ultimate punishment.
Exactly. The myth of Marsyas demonstrates how flaying transcended its physical reality and became a potent symbol within cultural narratives.
And this symbolism wasn't limited to ancient myths. We see it reflected in art as well. One striking example is Michelangelo's Last Judgment.
Within this monumental fresco depicting the final judgment of souls, Michelangelo included a rather intriguing detail. He painted himself as Saint Bartholomew, who is often depicted holding his own flayed skin.
What a powerful image. It speaks to the lasting impact of flaying on the human psyche, even centuries after it ceased to be a common practice.
It's as if the imagery of flaying holds a certain morbid fascination for us, compelling us to confront the extremes of human cruelty and suffering.
It makes you wonder why this particular form of torture continues to resonate with us. Perhaps it's a way of grappling with our own mortality, our vulnerability.
That's an interesting thought. Maybe it's a reminder of the fragility of our physical existence and the depths of pain that we are capable of inflicting and enduring.
And that fascination isn't limited to classical art or mythology. Flaying continues to appear in modern media as well, in books, movies, and even video games.
It seems that even today, flaying retains its ability to shock and disturb us. It speaks to a darker side of humanity that we may not fully understand, but are nonetheless drawn to.
It raises the question, what is it about flaying that continues to captivate and horrify us, even in a time when it's no longer practiced?
Perhaps it's the sheer brutality of the act, the violation of the human body that we find so unsettling. Or maybe it's the psychological impact, the way it represents the ultimate form of dehumanization and domination.
It's clear that flaying is more than just a historical curiosity. It's a subject that continues to provoke thought and discussion about the darker aspects of human nature.
It serves as a stark reminder of our capacity for cruelty and the importance of empathy and compassion.
Yeah, it really is. It's a sobering thought, but an important one to consider. Even though flaying is a practice largely relegated to the past, its legacy, it can teach us valuable lessons about ourselves and the societies we create.
I agree. It compels us to reflect on how we treat each other, how we exercise power, and the importance of safeguarding human dignity.
And perhaps it also reminds us of the fragility of civilization itself. How easily societies can descend into barbarity when empathy and compassion are absent.
Indeed. The history of flaying. It serves as a stark reminder of what we are capable of when we allow fear, hatred, or unchecked power to dictate our actions.
So while this deep dive into flaying has been a journey into the darker side of human history, I believe it ultimately reinforces the importance of striving for a better future.
A future where understanding, respect, and compassion guide our interactions with one another.
A future where the horrors of flaying remain firmly in the past, serving only as a cautionary tale.
And a reminder of the enduring human spirit that even in the face of unimaginable suffering, yearns for a world free from cruelty and violence.
Rat torture. Not an easy subject.
Right.
But we're diving into its history and significance today.
It's a dark subject for sure,
Yeah.
but one that offers a glimpse into the extremes of human behavior
Right.
and the use of power.
For sure. We've got some fascinating sources on this.
Oh.
One article talks about how rat torture wasn't just about physical pain.
Hmm.
It was a carefully calculated psychological torment.
That's a key point. The method was designed to exploit primal fears and break down a person's mental resistance.
So let's break this down. Can you walk me through what rat torture actually involved?
The typical process involved restraining the victim,
Okay.
often in a confined space.
Uh-huh.
Then live rats were introduced into that space.
Oh, wow.
Sometimes heat or fire was used to agitate the rats,
So you're trapped
making them frantic to escape.
claustrophobic and then these panicked rats.
Driven by instinct, the rats would try to find any way out,
Oh my gosh.
even if it meant burrowing into the victim's flesh.
That's horrifying. It's like a nightmare scenario brought to life.
It really is.
And it wasn't just the physical pain, right?
Sure.
Imagine the psychological torture of knowing what those rats were about to do.
Absolutely. The anticipation, the helplessness, the feeling of being invaded.
Right.
It was a calculated assault on the victim's mind.
One of the sources mentions that rat torture was sometimes a public spectacle. That's hard to grasp.
Yeah.
Did people actually stand there and watch?
Yes. In some cases, it was used as a public display of power.
Wow.
Imagine you're a peasant in medieval Europe,
Okay.
witnessing a public rat torture.
Mm-hmm.
What message does that send about who holds the power
Right.
and what happens if you disobey?
It's a chilling reminder of how power can be used to control and intimidate.
Yeah.
It wasn't just about punishing the individual, it was about sending a message to the entire community.
Precisely. It was a brutal form of social control,
Right.
meant to instill fear and obedience.
And this wasn't just limited to the Dark Ages, was it?
No,
The sources mention examples from different historical periods and cultures.
that's right. It's documented in various cultures throughout history.
Yeah.
It's particularly well known from Europe during the medieval and early modern periods, but it wasn't confined to those times.
One source actually mentions that even during the Renaissance,
Right.
a period often associated with art and enlightenment,
Yeah.
figures like Vlad the Impaler, who is known for his cruelty, were believed to have used this method. It's disturbing to think about such brutality existing alongside those cultural advancements.
It challenges our assumptions about historical progress, doesn't it?
For sure.
It forces us to confront the reality that even in periods of great intellectual and artistic flourishing,
Yeah.
the capacity for cruelty could still exist.
It's a sobering thought, and it makes you wonder how people in those times viewed this. Was it simply accepted, or was there any opposition to such brutal practices?
That's a complex question.
Yeah.
Societal norms and values were certainly different. Then
Right.
what might seem abhorrent to us today might have been viewed differently in a historical context.
It's a reminder that our own moral compass is shaped by the time and place we live in.
Absolutely. It's important to remember that our understanding of the past is always evolving. We're constantly uncovering new information and reinterpreting old narratives.
That makes sense.
No.
So while we can look back with horror at practices like rat torture,
Right.
it's also crucial to acknowledge the complexity of those historical contexts.
Exactly. It's not about condoning those actions, but understanding the factors that contributed to them.
One thing that struck me in the research is how the effectiveness of rat torture relied on a deep understanding of human psychology. It wasn't just brute force.
That's a fascinating observation. The torturers were exploiting not just the physical body,
Yeah.
the human psyche.
They were manipulating primal fears, our instinctual aversion to rats,
Right.
the fear of confinement, the dread of the unknown.
Right.
It's a chilling example of how cruelty can be amplified through psychological manipulation.
It speaks to the dark side of human ingenuity. The capacity to understand and exploit our vulnerabilities can be used for both good and evil.
And this brings up an important point. Even though rat torture has been outlawed for centuries, its symbolic power persists. It continues to appear in literature, film, even video games.
It's a testament to its ability to evoke a visceral reaction, even without the physical act.
Right.
The idea alone is enough to tap into our deepest fears.
It's like a nightmare scenario that resonates across cultures and time periods, a symbol of ultimate helplessness and terror.
And it's interesting to consider why something so horrific continues to captivate our imagination.
Is it because it forces us to confront the dark side of human nature, the potential for cruelty that exists within us all?
Perhaps it serves as a reminder of what we're capable of,
Yeah.
both as individuals and as a society.
It also raises questions about our own fascination with violence and horror. Why are we drawn to these dark subjects?
It's a complex question with no easy answers.
Right.
It could be a way of exploring our own fears in a safe environment,
Okay.
a way of confronting the darkness without actually experiencing it directly.
Maybe there's also an element of trying to understand the motivations behind such acts, to try and comprehend how someone could inflict such suffering on another human being.
That's a crucial aspect of studying history. We can't simply dismiss those who committed these acts as monsters.
Right.
We have to try to understand the social, political, and psychological factors that shaped their actions.
It's about seeking understanding, not justification.
Exactly. It's about recognizing the complexity of human behavior and the forces that can lead us down dark paths.
And ultimately, it's about learning from those past mistakes and working to ensure that such horrors are never repeated.
That's the hope by confronting the dark chapters of our history.
Right.
We can strive to create a future where human dignity is paramount.
One of the articles we have actually touches on how the symbolism of rat torture has evolved over time.
Okay.
It's not just about the physical act anymore. It's become a metaphor for various forms of oppression and psychological manipulation.
That's a powerful insight. The imagery of rat torture has been appropriated to represent broader themes of power control and the abuse of vulnerability. It's a reminder that torture can take many forms, not just physical.
It's a chilling thought, but an important one to consider. We need to be vigilant against all forms of cruelty and dehumanization, whether they're physical or psychological.
Absolutely. Recognizing the subtle forms of power and control is crucial in combating oppression in all its forms.
It's a reminder that the fight for human dignity is ongoing and requires constant vigilance.
And that we must never allow ourselves to become complacent or desensitized to the suffering of others.
That's a powerful message to end on.
It's fascinating how, even though the actual practice of rat torture is thankfully in the past, its imagery continues to resonate with us.
It's like this dark echo from history, a reminder of the depths of human cruelty. But it also makes you wonder, why does it stick with us?
Yeah.
Why does this particular form of torture hold such a grip on our imaginations?
Part of it might be the visceral nature of it. It taps into primal fears, the fear of being trapped, the fear of vermin, the fear of pain inflicted in such a relentless way.
It's like it bypasses all our defenses and goes straight to our core instincts.
And because it was a method intentionally devised by humans to inflict suffering on other humans,
Right.
it adds another layer of horror.
It's a reminder that we're capable of incredible cruelty, of using our intelligence and creativity for truly dark purposes.
And that capacity for cruelty isn't limited to the distant past.
Right.
We see it manifested in different ways throughout history and even in the present day.
That's a sobering thought. So when we encounter the imagery of rat torture today, whether it's in a historical account, a novel, or a film, what should we take away from it?
I think it serves as a powerful reminder of the fragility of human dignity,
That it can be so easily violated, so easily stripped away.
and that it's something we need to constantly safeguard both for ourselves and for others.
It's a call to action, to be vigilant against all forms of cruelty and dehumanization, whether they're physical or psychological.
And to remember that the fight for human rights and dignity is an ongoing struggle, one that requires our constant attention and effort.
It's a heavy topic, but one that's crucial to grapple with by understanding the darkness of the past. Maybe we can work towards a brighter future, a future where something like rat torture remains nothing more than a horrific relic of history.
That's the hope, that we can learn from the past, confront the darkness within ourselves, and strive to create a world where human dignity is truly paramount.
Well said. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive. It was definitely a tough one, but I think an important one.
I agree. It's essential to confront these difficult topics.
Until next time. The Brazen Bull.
Yeah.
Some pretty intense source material you sent over on this one.
It's a tough one for sure.
It's but fascinating and horrifying. A reminder, I guess, of humanity's capacity for cruelty,
Right.
but also a testament to our ingenuity,
Yeah.
even if it was used for, dark purposes.
Yeah. No, I think that's a good way to put it. It's a striking example of those two sides of human nature colliding. The level of craftsmanship that supposedly went into creating this device
Right.
is almost at odds with the sheer brutality that it was designed for.
Absolutely. And to think this all supposedly happened way back in 6th century BCE Greece, a time and place we often associate with, philosophy and democracy and art.
Right.
It's,
Yeah. It's important to remember that ancient Greece, for all its advancements, was also a world of stark contrasts. We're talking about a period where tyrants, rulers who seized power, often through brutal means, were a common feature of the political landscape.
Okay, so Tyrant back then didn't quite have the same meaning it does today. It wasn't just a label for a cruel or oppressive ruler. It was a specific type of political figure.
That's right. The term tyrant in ancient Greece referred to someone who ruled outside the established constitutional framework. They often came to power through force or popular support, promising change or stability, but their rule could be just as autocratic and brutal as any other form of government. And the Brazen Bull, if it truly existed, was a chilling symbol of that power.
Okay, so let's delve into the story of this device. We're talking about the city of Acragas in Sicily and its ruler, Phalaris.
Yes, Phalaris is really the central figure in this whole tale. He was known for his ruthlessness, his penchant for using fear and violence to maintain control, and it's within his court that the Brazen Bull is said to have been conceived and created.
It's hard to imagine someone coming up with such a horrific device, let alone actually building it. So who was the mind behind the Brazen Bull?
The inventor, or perhaps we should say the engineer of this nightmarish contraption, was a man named Perillos of Athens. He presented the Brazen Bull to Phalaris as a gift, a new and ingenious method for dispatching his enemies.
A gift. It seems more like a curse, disguised as a gesture of goodwill. What could have motivated Perillos to create something so gruesome?
It's impossible to know for sure, but ambition likely played a role. Imagine the audacity of presenting a tyrant with a new and improved way to inflict pain. Perhaps Perillos saw it as a way to gain favor, to secure a position in Phalaris' court.
Or maybe he was just a sadist, someone who derived pleasure from the suffering of others. Either way, it's a chilling thought.
Indeed. And the design of the Brazen Bull itself reflects that chilling combination of ingenuity and cruelty.
So let's talk about the design. From what I've read, it wasn't just a simple torture device. There was a level of artistry, even symbolism, woven into its construction.
Absolutely. The Brazen Bull was a life-sized bronze statue of a bull, hollow inside, with a door on the side. The victim would be placed inside this bronze prison, and then a fire would be lit beneath the bull, heating the metal until it became scorching hot. The person trapped inside would slowly roast to death. Their screams, amplified by a system of tubes and acoustic mechanisms within the bull, would be transformed into a sound resembling the bellow of a bull.
God, it's almost too horrific to imagine what happened next. But we have to understand the full extent of this device's cruelty, right?
Right.
It's hard to believe someone could come up with such a twisted concept. It wasn't just about inflicting pain. It was about turning that pain into a spectacle.
Precisely. And that's what makes the Brazen Bull so fascinating from a historical perspective. It reflects the values and anxieties of the time, a society where public executions weren't just about punishment, they were about performance, about sending a message to the masses.
It was a gruesome form of entertainment, a way for Phalaris to assert his power and instill fear in his subjects. The smoke billowing from the nostrils of the bronze bull, the sound of those distorted screams echoing through the city. It must have been a truly terrifying sight.
You've painted a very vivid picture. And keep in mind, all of this is based on accounts from ancient historians, whose writings are often a blend of fact and mythology. So the question remains, did this device truly exist, or was it a product of overactive imaginations? A cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked power.
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? We have accounts from writers like Diodorus Siculus, who describes the Brazen Bull in detail. But we also have historians like Herodotus, who mentions Phalaris' cruelty but never explicitly refers to the bull.
Yeah, and that lack of concrete evidence has fueled the debate for centuries. Some scholars argue that the Brazen Bull was a real device, a gruesome testament to the brutality of ancient tyrants. Others believe it was a literary invention, a symbol of the horrors that can arise when power is left unchecked.
So we're left with this fascinating puzzle, a story that could be historical fact, a cautionary tale, or perhaps a blend of both. It's hard to know for sure, but that ambiguity is part of what makes it so intriguing, isn't it? It makes you question how much of history is based on verifiable facts and how much is shaped by storytelling and the human need to make sense of the past.
You've hit on a crucial point. Even if we can't definitively prove the Brazen Bull's existence, the fact that the story has persisted for so long, woven its way into our collective imagination, speaks volumes. It taps into a primal fear, a fascination with the macabre that transcends time and culture.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's a story that's, even if it's not true, it sticks with you, makes you think, challenges your perceptions of the past, and maybe even of human nature itself.
It certainly does. I know I've been thinking a lot about the motivations of the people involved. Perillos, for example. What kind of person designs a torture device like that? Was it purely ambition? Or was there like a perverse sense of artistry involved as well?
Well, we can only speculate, of course, but I think it is interesting to consider the Brazen Bull within the context of, ancient Greek art and craftsmanship. The Greeks were masters of bronze working. They created stunning sculptures, intricate vessels, and weapons of war, all with incredible skill and precision.
So you're saying that Pyrrhus, in his own twisted way, was applying those same skills, that same artistic sensibility, to the creation of this horrific device.
It's a disturbing thought, but I think there's something to it. Remember, this was a time when public displays of violence were commonplace. Executions were often theatrical, meant to be seen and experienced by a large audience. And the brazen bull, with its lifelike design, the smoke billowing from its nostrils, the screams transformed into a bull's bellow, it was the ultimate spectacle of death.
It's almost like Pyrrhus was trying to elevate torture to an art form, to make it not just terrifying, but also, in a strange way, aesthetically pleasing.
A deeply unsettling concept, for sure. But it speaks to the complex relationship between beauty and brutality that has existed throughout human history. We see it in ancient gladiatorial combat, in the elaborate rituals surrounding human sacrifice in some cultures. There's this strange impulse to imbue even the most horrific acts with a sense of artistry, of spectacle.
Maybe it's a way of coping with the darkness, of making the unbearable somehow bearable by turning it into something we can observe, analyze, even appreciate on some level.
Perhaps. But let's not forget the victims in all of this. The people who were condemned to die inside the brazen bull. Their suffering was real, their terror unimaginable.
Right. It's easy to get caught up in the historical and cultural implications, but at its core, this is a story about human cruelty, about the abuse of power. And that brings us back to Phalaris. We've talked about his reputation for brutality, but what do we actually know about him?
Phalaris remains a somewhat enigmatic figure. As with many historical figures from that era, the line between fact and fiction is blurred. We know he ruled Acragas for about 16 years, and during that time, he established a reputation for being, ruthless and tyrannical.
And there's that famous story about his demise, right? The one where he gets a taste of his own medicine, so to speak.
You're talking about the tale of Phalaris being overthrown and executed in the brazen bull itself? It's a satisfying narrative, a classic example of poetic justice. But like many aspects of this story, its historical accuracy is debated.
So it's possible that the story of his death in the Brazen Bull is more legend than fact, a story meant to teach a lesson about the dangers of tyranny, even if it wasn't entirely true.
Exactly. And that's what makes the Brazen Bull such a compelling subject for discussion. It's a story that operates on multiple levels. It's a historical puzzle, a moral fable, and a symbol of both human ingenuity and our capacity for cruelty.
It's also a reminder that history isn't always black and white. There are shades of gray, ambiguous areas where truth and myth intertwine. And it's up to us, as curious minds, to explore those gray areas, to question what we think we know, and to be open to different interpretations of the past.
Well said. And in the case of the Brazen Bull, even if we can't definitively say whether it existed or not, the story itself has had a profound impact on our collective consciousness.
Right, it's become this iconic symbol of cruelty and tyranny, appearing in literature, art, film.
Yeah.
It's a story that continues to resonate with us centuries later.
That's the power of a potent symbol. It taps into our primal fears, our fascination with the macabre, and it forces us to confront the darker aspects of human nature. And in doing so, it reminds us of the importance of vigilance, of fighting against injustice, and of safeguarding our own humanity.
It's a sobering thought, but an important one. The Brazen Bull, whether real or mythical, serves as a warning from history. A reminder that the capacity for cruelty exists within us all, and that we must constantly strive to ensure that such darkness never prevails. It's interesting how, even if the Brazen Bull is ultimately a myth, the story has become so ingrained in our culture. We see it pop up in, books, movies, video games, almost like it's this universal symbol of cruelty.
Yeah. I think it's a testament to the story's power and the effectiveness of the imagery. Think about it. A hollow bronze bull, the victim screams turning into bellows. It's a concept that really lingers in your mind.
For sure. Are there any specific examples of the Brazen Bull appearing in works of art or literature that you find particularly striking?
Oh, there are quite a few, actually. One that immediately comes to mind is an 18th century painting by the Spanish artist Francisco Goya. It's titled The Brazen Bull. And it depicts the gruesome scene in really vivid detail, capturing the horror and suffering of the victims. And then there's the short story, The Torture of Hope, by the French writer Villiers de l'Isle-Adam.
Okay.
It uses the brazen bull as a metaphor for the psychological torment of a prisoner condemned to death, playing on the anticipation and dread leading up to the final moment.
It seems like the Brazen Bull is often used to explore not just physical pain, but also the psychological torment that comes with facing one's own mortality.
Absolutely. The enclosed space, the heat, the knowledge that there's no escape, it taps into primal fears of confinement and helplessness. It's a very powerful image that resonates with us on a really visceral level.
We focused a lot on the darkness and brutality associated with the Brazen Bull, but is there anything we can learn from this story? Any, positive takeaway?
I think there is. I think the story serves as a stark reminder of the dangers of unchecked power and the importance of speaking out against injustice. It encourages us to be critical thinkers, to question authority, and to never take our own freedom for granted.
Yeah. And it also highlights the power of storytelling, right?
Yeah.
And its ability to preserve the memory of past events, even if those events were shrouded in myth and legend.
Right. Stories like The Brazen Bull help us connect with the past, understand the complexities of human nature, and grapple with these really difficult questions about morality and justice. They remind us that history is not just a collection of facts and dates, but it's a tapestry woven with human experiences, both good and bad. And it's through engaging with these stories that we can learn from the past and hopefully create a better future.
That's a great point. The Brazen Bull may be a tale of horror, but it also offers a valuable lesson in empathy, critical thinking, and the importance of safeguarding human dignity.
Absolutely. It's a story that, despite its darkness, ultimately leaves us, I think, with a sense of hope and a renewed commitment to fighting for a more just and compassionate world.
The breaking wheel.
The breaking wheel, also known as the Catherine wheel, was a horrifying instrument of torture and execution used for centuries in Europe. Imagine a large wooden wheel similar to what you might see on an ox cart, but heavily reinforced with iron. This wheel, often studded with spikes or hooks, wasn't just a tool for death, it was a spectacle designed to inflict maximum pain and terror, a very public display of the power of the state.
It's hard to imagine the level of cruelty involved in designing such a device, let alone using it on another human being. Why was such brutality considered necessary?
The breaking wheel served a dual purpose. On a practical level, it was meant to punish criminals in the most severe way imaginable. Crimes like treason, murder, highway robbery, and even blasphemy could land you on the wheel. But it was more than just punishment. It was about sending a very clear message to the public. The prolonged suffering, the screams, the blood, it was all meant to instill fear in those who witnessed it. It was a way of maintaining control through terror.
So it was a form of psychological warfare, using fear to discourage disobedience and rebellion.
Precisely. The execution itself was just the culmination of a carefully orchestrated spectacle. The condemned person was often paraded through the streets to the execution site, further amplifying the public's anticipation and dread.
And once at the execution site, what would happen?
The condemned was stripped naked and bound to the wheel. Their limbs were carefully positioned between the spokes, making them vulnerable to the executioner's blows. The executioner, using a heavy iron hammer or club, would systematically break the victim's bones, starting with the legs and arms, working their way up the body.
It's almost too gruesome to comprehend. Did they try to kill the victim quickly?
No, quite the opposite. The goal was to prolong the suffering. The executioner had to strike with precision, shattering bones without delivering a fatal blow. Imagine the unimaginable pain, the screams echoing through the square as the crowd watched, a chilling reminder of the consequences of defiance.
It's hard to believe that anyone could endure such agony. What happened after the bones were broken?
The execution wasn't over. The victim's broken body was then intertwined with the wheel's spokes, their limbs woven through the spaces, creating a grotesque display. Then the wheel, with the victim still alive, was raised on a pole in a public square.
So they were left there to die, exposed to the elements in full view of everyone.
Yes. They were left to die slowly and painfully, sometimes for days, exposed to the sun, the rain, the birds. Their suffering served as a constant reminder to the public of the absolute power of the authorities. It was a brutal and effective way to maintain order in a time when life was cheap and punishment was swift and merciless.
You mentioned that the executioner would sometimes strike with precision to avoid a fatal blow. Was there ever any mercy shown to those condemned to the breaking wheel?
There was a practice called mercy strikes. where the executioner could deliver a final blow to the chest or head, ending the victim's suffering quickly.
So a faster death was considered an act of mercy.
In a way, yes. It was seen as a privilege sometimes granted to nobility or those who had cooperated with authorities. But for the common folk, there was rarely such mercy. Their suffering was part of the spectacle meant to serve as a warning to others.
It's unsettling to think that something so brutal could also have variations in its execution. Were there different ways this horrific act was carried out?
Yes, there were regional differences in the method. For example, in Germany, the wheel was often rotated during the breaking. The victim's body would be repeatedly smashed against an iron spike, adding another layer of brutality. It's a grim reminder that even within a system of such unimaginable cruelty, there was still room for innovation for making the punishment even more horrifying.
Speaking of variations, how was the execution handled in France?
In France, they sometimes skipped the wheel altogether. The victim was simply laid on the ground and beaten directly, their bones broken one by one with an iron bar. It seems the goal was always the same: to inflict as much pain and terror as possible. Each region seemed to have its own preferred method of achieving that goal.
It's chilling to think about the level of thought and planning that went into making the punishment as brutal as possible.
The breaking wheel wasn't just a random act of violence. It was a carefully calculated display of power, a gruesome spectacle designed to intimidate and control.
It's almost beyond comprehension that something so barbaric could be so widespread. Where else was the breaking wheel used as a form of punishment?
The breaking wheel wasn't limited to any single country or region. Its use was widespread across Europe, from England and France to Germany, Austria, and Switzerland. It was a common punishment in many parts of the Holy Roman Empire. It's a reminder that even in the so-called Age of Enlightenment, brutality and cruelty were still very much a part of the legal system.
We often think of progress as linear, but history shows us it's anything but. Given its widespread use, how long did the breaking wheel remain a common method of execution?
The breaking wheel remained in use for centuries, well into the 18th century in some parts of Europe. Think about that for a moment. While revolutions were happening, scientific discoveries were being made, and Enlightenment thinkers were challenging traditional ideas, this incredibly brutal form of punishment persisted.
It's a jarring juxtaposition, to say the least. What finally led to the decline of the breaking wheel?
The decline of the breaking wheel was a slow and gradual process influenced by changing social attitudes and evolving legal systems. As Enlightenment ideals spread, the emphasis shifted from punishment to rehabilitation. Ideas like the separation of powers and the right to a fair trial gained traction, and the public became increasingly uncomfortable with the spectacle of public torture.
So the decline of the breaking wheel was part of a larger societal shift away from public displays of brutality. It's fascinating how something so deeply ingrained in the legal system could eventually fall out of favor.
It's a testament to the power of ideas and the evolving nature of human morality. What was once considered acceptable punishment became increasingly seen as barbaric and inhumane.
The shift away from the breaking wheel seems to coincide with the rise of more modern forms of punishment, like imprisonment.
Exactly. As societies became more complex and the focus shifted to rehabilitation, prisons began to replace public executions as the preferred method of dealing with criminals. The idea was to reform criminals and reintegrate them into society rather than simply punishing them for their crimes. Of course, the modern prison system has its own set of problems, but it's a far cry from the brutality of the breaking wheel.
It's interesting that something so horrific could also have religious connotations. How did the breaking wheel become associated with religion?
In Christian contexts, the breaking wheel was sometimes seen as a form of divine retribution. The severity of the punishment was believed to reflect the gravity of the sin, and the torturer was almost seen as an agent of God carrying out his will.
So the breaking wheel wasn't just a tool of the state, it was also a symbol of God's justice.
Precisely. It's a reminder that religious beliefs have often been used to justify even the most extreme forms of violence and punishment. This connection to religion brings us to St. Catherine of Alexandria.
Ah, yes, the namesake of the Catherine wheel. Her story is a fascinating one. Tell me more.
St. Catherine of Alexandria was a Christian martyr who, according to legend, was condemned to death on the breaking wheel in the 4th century. However, when they tried to execute her, the wheel miraculously shattered, saving her life.
It's an incredible story, almost unbelievable. How did this event shape the legacy of the breaking wheel?
Because of this miracle, St. Catherine became associated with the breaking wheel. It transformed from a symbol of torture and execution into a symbol of her martyrdom, her faith, and her defiance. Her story inspired countless works of art, and the breaking wheel became a common motif in Christian iconography.
So the breaking wheel underwent a profound transformation in meaning, from a symbol of brutality to a symbol of faith and resistance.
It's a reminder that even the most horrific symbols can be reinterpreted and imbued with new meaning over time. The Catherine wheel, a type of firework, is a direct reference to St. Catherine's legendary escape.
It's fascinating how something that once instilled fear and dread could evolve into a celebratory symbol.
The breaking wheel's legacy extends beyond religious iconography and fireworks. It has found its way into literature, art, and even language. Phrases like broken on the wheel and third degree, which refers to a type of interrogation involving torture, have their roots in the brutal practice of the breaking wheel.
It seems the breaking wheel, despite its horrifying nature, has left an undeniable mark on our culture. Its story continues to be told and retold, even centuries after it fell out of use.
The breaking wheel serves as a stark reminder of humanity's capacity for cruelty and the dark side of our history. But it's important to remember that history is not just a collection of dates and facts. It's about understanding the forces that shaped our world, both good and bad.
It's about learning from the past, even the darkest chapters, so that we can create a more just and humane future. The breaking wheel may be a relic of the past, but its legacy continues to resonate. It's a stark reminder of the brutal punishments that were once commonplace and the long and often difficult journey towards a more just and humane world. What can we learn from the breaking wheel? What lessons does it hold for us today?
The breaking wheel serves as a powerful reminder that we must constantly be vigilant in protecting human rights and dignity. It's easy to look back at such practices with horror and disgust and believe that we are beyond such barbarity. But history has shown us time and again that the potential for cruelty is always present.
It's a sobering thought, and one that we should never forget. We live in a world where human rights are still violated, where torture and cruel punishments persist in some corners of the globe. The breaking wheel may be a relic of the past, but the lessons it teaches us are timeless.
Absolutely. The breaking wheel stands as a testament to the dangers of unchecked power, the importance of due process, and the need for a justice system that is fair and equitable for all. It's a reminder that we must always strive to create a society where every individual is treated with dignity and respect regardless of their alleged crimes.
It's also a testament to the power of empathy and the importance of recognizing the humanity in all people. It's easy to dehumanize those who have committed crimes, to see them as somehow less deserving of compassion and understanding. But the breaking wheel reminds us that even those who have committed the most heinous acts are still human beings capable of suffering and deserving of some measure of dignity.
The breaking wheel, for all its horror, can serve as a catalyst for reflection and conversation. It forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about our past and to examine our own beliefs about justice, punishment, and the nature of humanity. It challenges us to think critically about the systems we have in place and to ensure that they are truly just and humane.
It's a challenge that we must all take seriously if we hope to create a world where such brutality is truly a thing of the past.
Iron Maiden. Okay, so you've sent us a lot of information about the Iron Maiden, and it seems like you're really interested in separating fact from fiction with this thing.
Yeah.
Which is great, because this is a topic that has a lot of mystery and misconceptions surrounding it. So where do we even begin with this?
Well, a good place to start might be with the idea of mystery itself. You see, the Iron Maiden, though we often picture it in our minds with knights and castles, it might not be as medieval as we think.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
I always just kind of assumed it was like a classic medieval torture device.
Yeah, that is a common assumption, but the earliest descriptions we have of these devices actually come from the 18th century. So that's centuries after the medieval period had ended.
Huh. So what does that tell us then?
Well, it raises some questions about the Iron Maiden's actual use in the Middle Ages. Like, were they actually used back then, or were they created later as maybe museum pieces, or even propaganda tools?
Propaganda tools. That's an interesting take.
Yeah, just think about it. The image of the Iron Maiden is powerful. It's evocative, you know? Like a brutal, gruesome symbol of a barbaric past. It could have been used to kind of create a narrative, maybe to demonize past societies or to justify certain actions in the present.
Wow. Yeah, I never really considered that before. So the Iron Maiden's origins are a bit murky. What about the device itself? What did it look like?
Well, the descriptions we have paint a pretty terrifying picture. Imagine a human-shaped coffin. Often it was made of wood or metal, and inside there were spikes strategically placed.
I'm guessing the spikes weren't just there for decoration.
No, not really. It's the placement of the spikes that is particularly interesting. They were often placed in a way to avoid the victim's vital organs.
Why would they do that? It kind of seems counterproductive if the point was to kill.
Yeah, and that brings us to another disturbing aspect of the Iron Maiden. It wasn't just about death, it was about prolonged suffering. The spikes were meant to inflict pain, but not to kill immediately.
Oh, wow.
And some accounts even suggest that victims could be left inside for hours or even days.
Oh, that's awful. Just horrific. The mental torture on top of the physical pain.
Absolutely. And we can't forget about the psychological impact of the Iron Maiden's design. A lot of times they were decorated with grotesque faces or demonic figures, maybe even religious imagery.
Oh, wow.
It was all designed to amplify the terror and the despair of the person inside.
Yet it's almost like they were trying to break their spirit as much as their body.
Exactly.
So if we assume for a minute that the Iron Maiden was really used for torture, what were the reasons behind it?
Well, the historical accounts, even though a lot of them aren't reliable, they suggest there was a range of motives: punishing heresy or treason, forcing confessions, deterring rebellion. It seems like the threat of the Iron Maiden was a very powerful tool of control and intimidation.
Yeah, definitely.
It was very visceral and public,
Yeah.
this display of power. Yeah, it was meant to send a very clear message.
Yeah, it makes you wonder if the fear that it inspired was actually more effective than the actual use of it.
That's a really good point. And that leads us to another interesting part of this Iron Maiden mystery. Even though there are all these stories and legends about it, concrete evidence is really hard to come by.
So are we saying that the Iron Maiden might be more myth than reality?
It's not quite as simple as that. There definitely are some accounts that describe these Iron Maiden-like devices,
Okay.
but a lot of those accounts are from much later,
Hmm.
and their accuracy is definitely up for debate.
We talked earlier about the propaganda angle.
Right.
Could some of these accounts be exaggerated?
Yeah.
Or even just totally made up to fit some kind of narrative?
Definitely a possibility, and it really shows the power of the Iron Maiden as a symbol.
Yeah.
Whether or not it was widely used, the way we think it was,
Right.
it's taken hold of our imaginations.
Yeah.
It's become this really strong representation of cruelty.
It's interesting how we associate the Iron Maiden with specific times in history,
Uh-huh.
like the Middle Ages. But if the evidence for it being used then is so shaky, where does that association even come from?
That's a great question. It really highlights how our view of history can be shaped by these cultural narratives.
Okay.
Even when those narratives are not totally accurate, the Iron Maiden, it's in literature, film, even music. It's like a visual shorthand
Yeah.
for a kind of historical brutality.
Right.
But that brutality might be more in our heads than in reality.
So the Iron Maiden's legacy, it's about storytelling, just as much as it is about historical fact.
Exactly. And that brings us to probably the most famous example of the Iron Maiden,
Okay.
the Nuremberg Maiden.
Right, the one that everyone pictures when they hear the name. That one looks terrifying.
Yeah.
But is it even real?
That is the million-dollar question, isn't it? Like, a lot of the history surrounding the Iron Maiden, the authenticity of the Nuremberg Maiden is also up for debate.
Huh.
Some historians think that it was actually built a lot later, maybe even in the 19th century.
Wow.
Maybe just to be a macabre tourist attraction.
So even the poster child for the Iron Maiden could just be some modern invention.
It's definitely possible. And it just adds another layer to this whole story of the Iron Maiden. It's wrapped in mystery, the origins, the uses, even if it really existed at all,
Right.
it's still being debated today.
This is really making me think about how we look at history. It's easy to get caught up in the more exciting versions of things.
Yeah.
But we have to remember that there's often a lot more to the story than we first see.
For sure. And the Iron Maiden is a perfect example of that. It's a symbol that has gone beyond its historical context and become something a lot bigger.
Yeah.
A representation of our fascination with the dark side of human nature and our anxieties about pain and punishment.
Right.
And maybe our attempt to understand the past.
And what about the heavy metal band Iron Maiden?
Oh, yeah.
They've certainly helped keep this image of the Iron Maiden alive in our culture.
Absolutely. Their music and their imagery, a lot of it draws on these historical themes, including torture and punishment. They've even used the Iron Maiden in their artwork and their stage shows.
It's interesting how something with such a dark and debated history has become such a big part of our collective consciousness.
Yeah.
I mean, whether it was a real torture device or just something we made up,
Right.
it continues to capture our attention and make us feel uneasy.
It does. I think it shows just how powerful it is as a symbol. It taps into these basic feels we have, like pain and being trapped.
Yeah.
Maybe even our morbid curiosity about how cruel humans can be.
Yeah, it's almost like the Iron Maiden itself is this kind of tension between what's real and what we perceive.
Uh-huh.
I mean, whether it was used the way we hear in the legends or if it's just a figment of our collective imagination, it's become this really potent symbol.
Exactly. It's bigger than itself now, you know?
Right.
It represents something much bigger.
It makes you wonder what's more terrifying, the thought that this was a real thing,
Right.
or that we as humans could even imagine something like this, even if it was just in our minds.
That's a great question to think about, and I think it speaks to why we're still talking about it today.
Yeah.
You know, the Iron Maiden, whether it's historically accurate or not, it makes us face some uncomfortable truths about ourselves.
Yeah, we may never really know if or how much the Iron Maiden was used, but its impact on how we think is undeniable. It still fascinates us and horrifies us, and it makes us question what we think we know about the past.
It definitely serves as a reminder of the dark side of humanity,
Yeah.
and it challenges us to really think about those parts of our history and our nature.
It also makes you think about how important critical thinking is.
Right.
Questioning what we see and hear, and really looking for evidence to back up what we believe, especially when it comes to stories as powerful and as emotionally charged as this one.
For sure. We need to be careful in our search for truth.
Yeah.
Especially when we're dealing with something as sensitive and potentially misleading as torture and punishment.
Well, this has been a really thought-provoking look at the Iron Maiden. A journey through history, myth, and the power of symbols.
It really is fascinating.
Thanks for going on this journey with us. The Judas Cradle. Even the name sends chills down your spine, right? You might have heard whispers of this medieval torture device, but are you ready to delve into the chilling reality?
It wasn't designed for a quick death. The design was all about maximizing pain and humiliation.
Yeah, from the sources we've got, it looks like the Judas Cradle, also called the Judas Chair, was this pyramid-shaped seat, often made of wood or metal, with a very sharp point at the top. But this wasn't any ordinary chair.
That sharp point was designed to pierce the most sensitive parts of the body. The victim was stripped naked, bound, and then slowly lowered onto that point. Their own weight would intensify the agony.
Can you imagine the psychological torment? To be completely vulnerable and then impaled on this horrifying device, knowing it's not going to end quickly.
The sources indicate that it was often used in public, too. This public display added another layer of shame and degradation.
And if that isn't awful enough, some sources say torturers would sometimes pull the victim up slightly and then lower them again, just to intensify the pain.
It's a truly brutal example of how torture was used not just to inflict physical pain, but to completely break a person's spirit.
The name Judas itself is interesting. It connects the victim to the biblical figure who betrayed Jesus.
Adding Judas to the name implies that the person being tortured was also a traitor, a heretic, a threat to the established order. It adds an extra layer of cruelty.
The sources suggest that the Judas Cradle was primarily used during the Middle Ages and often linked to the Spanish Inquisition.
It was a time of intense religious and political upheaval. The Inquisition was tasked with rooting out heresy and dissent, and they weren't afraid to use extreme measures.
So the Judas Cradle wasn't just a torture device. It was a symbol of power and control, a way to instill fear and obedience.
Absolutely. The fact that it was sometimes used in public amplifies that effect. Witnessing this kind of gruesome spectacle would send a powerful message to anyone who dared to question authority.
It makes you wonder, though, how much what we know about the Judas Cradle is based on fact and how much is exaggeration or propaganda.
That's an important question. The sources themselves acknowledge that historical documentation is scarce. Much of what we know comes from secondhand accounts, which can be unreliable.
So there's a possibility that some of the more gruesome details were embellished over time to demonize the Inquisition or reinforce certain narratives.
It's certainly a possibility. Historians are still debating the extent to which the Judas Cradle was actually used and the precise methods employed.
Even if some of the accounts are exaggerated, the very idea of this device is enough to send chills down your spine.
It challenges our modern sensibilities. We live in a time where torture is widely condemned as a violation of human rights. But for centuries, it was a common practice, often carried out in the name of justice or religion. It makes you wonder, how far have we really come?
Reading about it, you can't help but be struck by the sheer brutality of it all. It's hard to believe that something so barbaric was actually used on human beings.
The design of the Judas Cradle was all about maximizing pain and suffering. The point wasn't meant to kill quickly. It was meant to tear and stretch the flesh, causing excruciating agony that could last for hours, even days.
And we can't forget the psychological torment, which was just as significant as the physical pain. The victim was stripped naked, exposed, and subjected to a form of torture that was specifically designed to humiliate and degrade.
What's really chilling is that the Judas Cradle was often part of a larger system of torture. Victims might be subjected to other forms of torture before or after being placed on the Judas Cradle, things like whipping, burning, or sleep deprivation.
It's hard to imagine the cumulative effect of such prolonged and systematic abuse, both physically and psychologically.
The goal was often to break the victim's will completely, to force them to confess to crimes, real or imagined, or to renounce their beliefs. Imagine being subjected to that.
And the use of religious symbolism, like the name Judas itself, adds another layer of cruelty and manipulation to the whole process.
By associating the victim with a figure of betrayal and damnation, the torturers were attempting to not only inflict physical pain, but also to undermine their spiritual and moral standing.
The sources suggest that the Judas Cradle was primarily used by authorities, both religious and secular, as a way to maintain power and control.
It was a tool of intimidation and repression used to silence dissent and enforce conformity to the prevailing social and religious norms.
And its use was often shrouded in secrecy, which only added to the fear and mystery surrounding it.
The fact that we have limited historical documentation about the Judas Cradle speaks to the efforts that were made to conceal its use and the extent of its brutality. It makes you wonder what else is hidden away in the historical record.
The Judas Cradle may be a relic of a bygone era, but it serves as a stark reminder of the dangers of unchecked power and the importance of safeguarding human rights.
It makes you appreciate how far we've come as a society in terms of recognizing and protecting human rights. Even the idea of this type of torture is appalling to us now.
Yeah, it's true. The very notion of using torture as a form of punishment or interrogation, it's widely condemned by international law and ethical standards now.
But it's important to remember that these darker chapters of history aren't that far behind us. It's a reminder to remain vigilant and to fight against any attempts to erode the progress we've made.
Yeah, the fight for human rights is an ongoing one. We must never take those rights for granted or become complacent in defending them. It's easy to think that was then, this is now, but it's important to stay aware.
Right. Getting back to the Judas Cradle itself, the sources mention that there's some debate among historians about the extent to which it was actually used.
Really? I assumed its use was widespread, at least during a certain period. Why is that debated?
Well, some historians argue that the historical evidence is somewhat scarce. They say that the accounts we do have may have been exaggerated or even fabricated for propaganda purposes.
That makes sense. There would naturally be conflicting accounts and interpretations, especially given the sensitive nature of the topic and the time period involved.
Exactly. It's crucial to approach historical sources with a critical eye, considering the potential biases and motivations of those who recorded them. It's all too easy to misinterpret or embellish things, even unintentionally.
So while the Judas Cradle may have become a symbol of the horrors of medieval torture, there's still some uncertainty surrounding its actual use and prevalence.
That's an important nuance to keep in mind. It doesn't diminish the brutality of the device itself or the fact that it was likely used in some capacity. But it does highlight the complexities of historical research and interpretation. We don't always have a clear or complete picture of the past.
That's a good point. History can be messy. The sources also mention that the design of the Judas Cradle was specifically intended to prolong suffering rather than cause immediate death.
That's right. The pyramid-shaped point was not designed to pierce vital organs. Instead, it was meant to slowly stretch and tear the flesh, causing excruciating pain that could last for hours or even days.
The cruelty involved in devising and using such a device is difficult to comprehend. What kind of person could even imagine something like that?
It speaks to a mindset that viewed pain and suffering as legitimate tools of control and punishment. It's a mindset that we have thankfully largely moved away from in modern society.
But it's a reminder that those impulses still exist within humanity. Even if they are now more often veiled or disguised, the potential for cruelty is always lurking.
That's a crucial point. We must remain vigilant against any attempts to normalize or justify torture, no matter the context or rationale. Torture is never acceptable.
So even though the Judas Cradle may be a relic of the past, Its legacy serves as a powerful reminder of the dangers of unchecked power and the importance of safeguarding human rights. What do you think is the most important takeaway for our listeners?
The Judas Cradle stands as a chilling symbol of the dark side of human nature. It's a reminder that we must always strive to uphold the principles of compassion, justice, and human dignity in everything we do.
It's crazy to think that a device like this actually existed. It's a stark reminder of how cruel people can be to each other.
Yeah, it's a sobering thought. The Judas Cradle, though horrific, is just one example of the many ways torture has been used throughout history.
That's true. We can't forget that torture still exists in the world today. It might not look like the Judas Cradle, but the underlying principles of inflicting pain and breaking someone's will remain the same.
Exactly. That's why it's crucial to understand the historical context of torture, like with the Judas Cradle. It helps us recognize the warning signs and fight against its use in any form.
Do the sources mention any other torture devices from that time period? I'm curious to know what else they used.
Yeah, they do. Some sources describe devices like the rack, which stretch the victim's body, and the thumb screws, which crush their thumbs and fingers. The ingenuity of these devices is as disturbing as their purpose.
It's horrifying. It's hard to believe that anyone could invent such things, let alone use them on another human being.
It speaks to a very dark side of human nature, the capacity for cruelty, but it also speaks to the resilience of the human spirit. Despite the horrors they endured, many victims of torture refused to break.
That's a powerful reminder that even in the face of unimaginable cruelty, the human spirit can endure.
Absolutely. The Judas Cradle and other torture devices may be relics of the past, but their legacy serves as a constant warning. We must never forget the atrocities that humans are capable of, and always fight for a world where such cruelty is unthinkable.
Well said. This deep dive has been a sobering reminder of the darkness that can exist within humanity, but it's also been a reminder of the importance of fighting for human rights and dignity.
It's a fight that requires constant vigilance and a commitment to upholding the values of compassion and justice. We must never allow ourselves to become complacent.
Thank you for guiding us through this difficult but important topic. It's been eye-opening, to say the least.
It's been my pleasure. Remember, learning about the past, even the dark parts, helps us create a better future.
The Pear of Anguish.
Yeah.
When we think of medieval torture, this device often comes to mind.
It does.
We have some historical accounts and analyses of this infamous object, so let's dive in and see what we can uncover.
Yeah, it's interesting, because while the Pear of Anguish has this gruesome reputation, its place in history is a bit murky. There's a lot of debate about how widespread its use actually was.
So for those who might not be familiar, can you describe what this Pear of Anguish actually is?
Sure. Well, imagine a pear-shaped metal device with these segmented leaves that can be expanded outward by turning a screw at the base.
Yeah.
It's designed to be inserted into an orifice, the mouth, rectum, or vagina, and then, the idea is that as the screw turns, those segments expand, causing excruciating pain and damage.
It's a truly chilling concept.
Yeah.
And the sources mentioned there were different types of pears for different areas of the body, each associated with particular accusations or punishments.
Exactly.
So, like what?
For example, the oral pear was supposedly used on those accused of blasphemy. Now, blasphemy basically meant speaking against God or the church.
Right.
To fully grasp the significance of this, you have to consider the immense power the church held at that time.
Right.
They could use this device to silence anyone who dared to question their authority.
That adds a whole new layer to the concept of the pear being a tool of not just physical torture, but also social control.
Precisely. And this lack of concrete evidence about its widespread use leads us to a fascinating question. Was the pear more of a symbolic threat than a routinely used tool?
Okay.
Some historians believe it might have been part of a larger system of intimidation, designed to instill fear and obedience.
Makes sense. That makes sense, especially when you consider the psychological impact. Even the threat of such a device would have been terrifying.
Absolutely. Imagine the constant fear, the self-censorship, the chilling effect it would have had on any potential dissent.
The sources also mentioned that the rectal and vaginal pears were associated with accusations of sexual misconduct and heresy.
And it's important to note that these accusations were often intertwined with power dynamics.
Okay.
Women, especially those who challenged social norms or religious doctrine, were particularly vulnerable to accusations of heresy or witchcraft, which could then be used to justify the use of these horrific devices.
So the Pear of Anguish wasn't just about punishment. It was also about maintaining control, silencing opposition and reinforcing existing power structures.
Exactly. And while we might never know the full extent of its actual use, the symbolic power of the pear is undeniable.
Right.
It's an image that has resonated through the centuries, capturing our imaginations and reminding us of the darker side of human history.
Speaking of its lasting impact, the sources also point out how the Pear of Anguish has appeared in popular culture, in movies, literature, and art.
That's right. And this continued fascination is interesting, isn't it?
Yeah.
Why are we still so drawn to this object, even if its historical reality is shrouded in some mystery?
Perhaps it's because it embodies some of our deepest fears. The fear of pain, of helplessness, of being silenced. Or maybe it's a way for us to grapple with the darker aspects of human nature, to try and understand how such cruelty is possible.
It's almost like a morbid curiosity,
Yeah.
a desire to peer into the abyss of human behavior and see what we find. But before we delve too deeply into the psychology of it all, let's take a closer look at the specific ways the pear was allegedly used.
Yes, the sources do mention a range of purposes, from punishment for specific crimes to public humiliation and even interrogation. And these weren't always mutually exclusive.
Right.
A single act of torture could serve multiple purposes.
That's a crucial point. It speaks to the calculated nature of torture, the deliberate use of pain and fear to achieve specific aims.
Yeah.
But it also adds a layer of complexity to our understanding of the pear.
Right.
It wasn't just a tool for inflicting suffering.
Mm.
It was also a means to an end, whether that end was punishment, control, or the extraction of information.
It's certainly a lot to unpack. And it raises some unsettling questions about the nature of power, cruelty, and the lengths to which humans will go to achieve their goals.
And it's important to remember that the impact of the pear wasn't limited to just physical pain. The psychological trauma it inflicted could be just as devastating, if not more so.
Yeah, you're right. The sources really highlight that aspect. The mental and emotional anguish, the lasting scars, left behind.
Imagine the sheer terror of knowing what this device was capable of, the fear of being subjected to it, the anticipation of pain. It's a form of psychological torture in itself.
And then there's the humiliation factor. The sources mentioned the public nature of these punishments, the way they were used to shame and degrade the victim in front of their community.
Absolutely. It wasn't just about inflicting pain. It was about breaking the individual's spirit, stripping them of their dignity, and isolating them from their social circle.
So even if someone survived the physical ordeal, they were left to deal with the social stigma, the whispers and judgments of their neighbors.
Precisely. And that social isolation, that feeling of being ostracized, could be just as damaging as any physical wound.
It makes you wonder how the mere existence of such a device, the threat of its use, impacted the overall social climate. Did it create a culture of fear and self-censorship?
It's a fascinating question. The sources don't delve into the broader societal impact in detail, but it's certainly something worth considering. Did people avoid speaking their minds, expressing dissent, or challenging authority for fear of facing the pear?
It's certainly possible. And if that's the case, then the Pear of Anguish served its purpose, even without being widely used. It became a symbol of oppression, a tool for maintaining control through fear and intimidation.
And that brings us back to the debate about its historical reality. Even if the pear was rarely used in practice, the idea of it, the stories told about it, would have had a profound impact on people's lives.
Yeah. It's a reminder that sometimes the threat of violence can be just as effective as the act itself, especially when it comes to shaping behavior and maintaining power.
Absolutely. And the pear, with its evocative design and horrifying implications, was a particularly potent symbol of that power.
It's interesting to think about the pear's enduring legacy in popular culture. Why do you think we're still so fascinated by this object centuries after it was supposedly used?
I think it taps into a deep-seated human fascination with the macabre, the gruesome, the forbidden. There's a certain allure to these dark chapters of history, a desire to understand the extremes of human behavior.
And the Pear of Anguish, with its combination of ingenuity and cruelty, its blend of physical and psychological torture, certainly represents an extreme.
It does. And perhaps by exploring these dark corners of our past, by confronting these unsettling truths about ourselves, we can gain a better understanding of the present and hopefully work towards a future where such horrors are relegated to the history books.
The sources also mention that some of the Pears of Anguish on display in museums today are actually modern recreations or inspired by historical accounts. This blurring of the lines between fact and fiction adds another layer of intrigue to the story.
It does, and it raises some interesting questions about how we interpret and represent history. Are we perpetuating myths and legends, or are we attempting to shed light on a dark and often hidden past?
It's a delicate balance,
Hmm.
but I think it's important to approach these artifacts and stories with a critical eye, to acknowledge the gaps in our knowledge
Yeah.
and to be open to different interpretations.
I agree. And while the Pear of Anguish may always remain shrouded in some mystery, the questions it raises about power, cruelty, and human nature are as relevant as ever.
Yeah, it's fascinating how an object like this, even with this, murky history, can hold such a powerful grip on our imaginations.
I think it speaks to our, innate desire to understand the darker side of human nature. The Pear of Anguish, whether fact or exaggerated myth, represents a convergence of ingenuity and cruelty that both repels and fascinates us.
Yeah,
You know?
it forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about ourselves, about our capacity for both inflicting and enduring pain.
Right. And it challenges us to consider how societies throughout history have used fear and violence to maintain control and enforce conformity.
The Pear of Anguish, with its chilling symbolism, serves as a stark reminder of the fragility of human rights and the ever-present potential for abuse of power.
It's a lesson that transcends the specifics of medieval torture and resonates throughout history, reminding us to be vigilant in safeguarding those rights and challenging those who seek to undermine them.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive, from the gruesome mechanics of the pear to the historical debates surrounding its use and its lasting legacy in popular culture.
It's been a journey through some dark and unsettling territory, but I think it's been a worthwhile one.
Absolutely. It's by confronting these difficult aspects of our past that we can learn from them and strive to create a better future.
Perhaps the Pear of Anguish, despite its horrific nature, can serve as a catalyst for reflection, for dialogue, and for a renewed commitment to human dignity and compassion.
It's a heavy legacy to carry, but one that we can't afford to ignore. The rack?
The rack. It's often cited as one of history's most brutal torture devices.
When we think about torture, we often focus on the physical pain. But what were the psychological effects of an instrument like the rack, both on the victim and the torturer?
Well, for the victim, the psychological torment began long before they even touched the rack. The anticipation, the knowledge of what was to come would have been incredibly powerful. Then there's the helplessness, the inability to escape the inevitable pain, the gradual tightening of the ropes, the slow, deliberate infliction of pain, all contributed to a sense of dread and utter powerlessness.
And once the physical torture began, how did that impact the victim's mental state?
The pain inflicted by the rack was excruciating, often leading to dislocations, fractures, and severe nerve damage. This level of physical agony could push people to the brink of madness. Victims might experience hallucinations, delusions, or even complete psychological breakdowns.
It's horrifying to imagine what those victims endured.
It is, and we can't forget the psychological impact on the torturer. To inflict that level of pain on another human being day after day would require a certain level of detachment, a desensitization to suffering.
It makes you wonder what kind of person could carry out such acts.
Some historians argue that torturers were often ordinary people who, under the pressures of their roles and the prevailing societal norms, became capable of horrific acts. Others might have found a perverse sense of power or even sadistic pleasure in inflicting pain.
You mentioned societal norms. How is the use of torture like the rack viewed by society at the time? Was it widely accepted?
In medieval and early modern Europe, torture was an integral part of the legal system. It was considered a legitimate means of extracting confessions, punishing criminals, and maintaining order. Public executions and torture were common, serving as both a deterrent and a spectacle.
It's hard to comprehend that such brutality was once considered acceptable. What factors contributed to this societal acceptance of torture?
Several factors were at play. The prevailing religious beliefs of the time emphasized punishment and retribution. The legal system lacked the sophisticated investigative techniques we have today, so torture was often seen as a necessary tool to obtain confessions. And then there's the element of fear. Public displays of torture served to instill terror in the population, discouraging dissent and rebellion.
So the rack wasn't just a tool of punishment, it was also a tool of control.
Absolutely. The rack and other forms of torture were used to maintain power, to silence opposition, and to reinforce the authority of the ruling class. It was a way to keep the populace in line through fear and intimidation.
It's fascinating how an object like the rack can become such a powerful symbol, both in its time and even today.
The rack transcended its function as a mere instrument of torture. It became a potent symbol of absolute power, of the state's ability to inflict unimaginable pain and suffering on its citizens.
And its use wasn't limited to one specific region or culture, was it?
No, the rack and variations of it were used throughout Europe in various forms, from the medieval period into the early modern era. This widespread use speaks to the pervasiveness of torture in European justice systems at the time.
You mentioned the Inquisition earlier. Did the use of the rack differ depending on the context, say between legal proceedings and religious inquisitions?
The Inquisition, particularly the Spanish Inquisition, is often associated with the use of torture. The rack was just one tool in their arsenal employed to root out heresy and enforce religious orthodoxy. The methods and severity of torture could vary depending on the accusations, the inquisitor involved, and the political climate of the time.
Given the brutality of the rack, how did its use eventually decline? Was there a particular turning point in history that led to its abolition?
The decline of the rack and other forms of judicial torture was a gradual process driven by a confluence of factors. The Enlightenment, with its emphasis on reason, individual rights, and humane treatment, played a significant role. Thinkers like Cesare Beccaria, who wrote On Crimes and Punishments, argued against the effectiveness and barbarity of torture.
So philosophical arguments against torture began to gain traction.
Yes. These arguments, coupled with growing public awareness of the horrors of torture and changing societal attitudes, led to reforms in legal systems across Europe. The French Revolution, with its focus on human rights and the rule of law, further accelerated the move away from torture as a legitimate form of punishment.
It's interesting to consider how the rack, once a symbol of power and control, became a symbol of the barbarity of the past.
The rack's transformation into a symbol of cruelty is a testament to the evolution of our understanding of justice, human rights, and the limits of state power. Its image serves as a stark reminder of the dark side of human history, of our capacity for cruelty and the importance of safeguarding individual rights.
Speaking of its image, the rack continues to appear in popular culture, in movies, books, even political cartoons.
The rack's enduring presence in popular culture underscores its lasting impact on the collective consciousness. It has become a shorthand for cruelty, oppression, and the abuse of power. Its image evokes a visceral reaction, reminding us of the horrors that can occur when power goes unchecked and individual rights are violated.
Why do you think we remain captivated by such a gruesome device? Is it purely morbid curiosity or something more?
Perhaps it's a combination of factors. There's the element of morbid curiosity, the desire to peer into the darker corners of human history. But I think there's also a deeper psychological need to confront our past, to understand how such atrocities could occur, and to ensure that they are never repeated.
So by studying the rack, by understanding its history and its symbolism, we are, in a sense, trying to learn from the mistakes of the past.
Exactly. The rack serves as a cautionary tale, a reminder of what can happen when fear, intolerance, and the pursuit of power override basic human decency and respect for individual rights.
It's a reminder that the progress we've made in terms of human rights is not something to be taken for granted, but something that must be constantly defended and upheld.
Absolutely. The fight for human rights is an ongoing struggle. The rack may be a relic of the past, but the potential for cruelty, oppression, and the abuse of power still exists. We must remain vigilant in protecting individual rights and ensuring that such barbarity never again becomes the norm.
The rack may no longer be in use, but its legacy continues to shape our understanding of justice and punishment.
Yeah, the rack serves as a powerful reminder of the evolution of our ethical and legal systems. Its decline and eventual abolition reflect a fundamental shift in our values, a growing recognition of the inherent dignity of every human being, and the need to protect individuals from cruel and inhumane treatment.
It also highlights the importance of transparency and accountability in legal proceedings.
Yeah.
The use of torture, like the rack, often took place in secrecy behind closed doors with little or no oversight.
Right. The secrecy surrounding torture allowed for abuses to go unchecked. It created an environment where the powerful could operate with impunity, inflicting pain and suffering without fear of consequence. The move away from torture was accompanied by a push for greater transparency in legal systems, for due process, and for the right to a fair trial.
So the abolition of the rack wasn't just about outlawing a specific device. It was about a broader shift towards a more just and humane legal system.
Precisely. It was about recognizing that justice should not be based on fear, coercion, or the infliction of pain. It should be based on fairness, impartiality, and respect for individual rights.
As we've discussed, the rack was not only a tool of punishment, but also a tool of control. It was used to silence dissent, to maintain order, and to reinforce the authority of the ruling class.
The rack's use as a tool of political repression is a chilling reminder of the dangers of unchecked power. It highlights the need for checks and balances for a free press and for an informed citizenry that can hold those in power accountable.
It also underscores the importance of protecting freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, and the right to dissent. These rights are essential safeguards against tyranny and oppression, ensuring that individuals can speak out against injustice without fear of reprisal.
Absolutely. The lessons we learned from the rack are not just historical artifacts, they are relevant to the challenges we face today. In an age of terrorism, global conflict, and political polarization, the temptation to resort to extreme measures to compromise our values in the name of security can be strong.
It's a slippery slope. Once we start down the path of justifying cruelty and violence, it becomes increasingly difficult to turn back.
The rack serves as a potent reminder of that slippery slope. It reminds us that even in the face of fear and uncertainty, we must never abandon our commitment to human rights, to due process, and to the rule of law. These principles are the foundation of a just and civilized society and must be protected at all costs.
The rack stands as a stark reminder of the depths of human cruelty, but also the potential for positive change. It's a testament to our capacity for both darkness and light, for barbarity and compassion. By studying the past, by confronting the uncomfortable truths of our history, we can strive to create a future where such atrocities are never repeated.